Hello and welcome to another reflection this week from All Saints Nosing. Jesus was a storyteller. He told so many parables to try and expose a kind of deeper truth, to help people see and understand what God wanted from them. Here this week we listen to a parable from Matthew 22 verses 1 to 14. Jesus spoke to the chief priests and the Pharisees, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who'd been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who've been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fat calves that have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to a wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the gospel of the Lord. The parable of the wedding banquet comes just after the episode in Matthew where Jesus overturns the tables in the temple and shouts at the money changers. In the context of Matthew, this parable is a challenge to the hierarchy, and it reads as critical to those in authority. There's often more than one way to hear a story, depending on the times that we're living in and the context in which we hear it. I wonder how we hear this parable today in our own times, as we live through the difficulties of COVID, environmental disaster, as we see a lot of greed and the abuse of others around us. Who are the Pharisees and the priests in our own times who we feel angry and frustrated with? Who are the ones we feel are ignoring the call because they're too busy and preoccupied with their own lives to bother with the King's invitation? Who are the ones that are living with such contempt for others that they're prepared to maltreat and even kill them? It's dangerous to cast people in these roles, perhaps because they're aspects of us all at times. Don't we all abuse sometimes positions of power and authority? Don't we sometimes all get too preoccupied with our daily lives, with work, with the things that we're interested in, to notice that God is calling us all to this wonderful opportunity? And aren't we all at times, sometimes without even realizing or intending it, caught up in a culture of sin and of death? Nonetheless, God still keeps inviting us to that fullness of life, which is the banquet. This is the God of whom Isaiah says in Isaiah 25, 1-9, "You have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. This is a God who perpetually invites us to a feast of rich food, a God who promises to wipe away the tears and disgrace of his people, to swallow up death forever. And how we long for that in these days. Not being worthy is not the worst of our problems, as you can hear from the end of Jesus' parable. And I think Jesus is getting at is that it's one thing to ignore the invitation, but it's quite another thing to accept the invitation and yet have such lack of respect for the host, to turn up unprepared and improperly dressed. In recent days, the Church of England has been absolutely roasted, and deservedly so, by the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse for failing hundreds of children and young people by failing to respond adequately to those events. And this over the past 80 years. And what is terrible is that, rather like the guest who comes to the wedding banquet unprepared, we did know better. We did know what was expected of us. We should, in the words of St. Paul in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verses 1 to 9, we know what is true, what is honourable, what is just, what is pure, what is commendable, what is pleasing, and what is excellent. And yet we failed. We got it so wrong. We are rightfully ashamed, and we deserve to be ashamed, because we knew what was expected of us, and we failed, and we let God down. But this isn't the only example. There are other ways we are living in our world, conscious that our behaviour is not what is right or what is expected of us. And it's not just the church, it's businesses, us as individuals. We know we are living on a planet with limited resources. We know in these times when we deplore historic slavery that we are living with modern slavery and possibly benefiting from it in everyday lives, and yet we're doing nothing about it. We know that we should not be using so much plastic. We have been warned. We are aware. When we live in the world, aware that we're expected to live in a certain way, and we fail to respond, we're behaving like those willful and contemptuous guests at the party in God's home, which is a home for all people, for all creatures. The call to the banquet isn't just an invitation to the righteous to come and have a lovely time. It's the call to put ourselves straight with God, to prepare our hearts and minds to be receptive to the way God wants us to be. Only with the right attitude and the right heart will we be adequately prepared. And we are promised God will wipe away our tears and our disgrace, and God will bring us rejoicing again into his heavenly kingdom